Good afternoon and welcome to today's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission hearing on the human rights implications of last October's military coup d'etat in Sudan. Today marks the Commission's seventh hearing on the human rights situation in Sudan since its founding in 2008. And I cannot emphasize enough how deeply sorry I am that we have to be here examining today's topic. Like so many of my colleagues, I have worked for human rights, humanitarian aid, and the rights of the Sudanese people to determine their own future for over 16 years. I even led congressional protests and was arrested 3 different times in support of human rights and humanitarian workers in Sudan. The first time in April 2006 with my good friend and our beloved former colleague, Tom Lantos. So I am one of many in the U.S. Congress who welcomed the 2019 Constitutional Declaration and the later Juba Agreement. I celebrated the hard-fought, well-earned democratic opening that followed. In a world filled with tragedy and backsliding, Sudan finally was a good news story. When the regime of President Bashir collapsed from the pressure by Sudan's civil society, I expressed concerns over the military's inclusion in the transitional government. But over the past 2 years, Sudan was moving and establishing a democratic government, rule of law, and respect for human rights. Progress was often difficult, but the future seemed to hold great potential. And then came the coup on October 25th. As we will hear today, the military's action was not entirely a surprise. There were signs of tension in the civilian-military power-sharing agreement before the coup, including a pro-military sit-in in which protesters demanded the overthrow of failed civilian leaders. But from where I sit, it's not clear that we expected the situation to come to a head in the way that it did. I'll be interested to hear what our witnesses have to say about signs we either missed or didn't take seriously enough. It has been heartening to see the immediate, almost universal condemnation and rejection of the coup. Just yesterday, tens of thousands of Sudanese again took to the streets to demand a genuine civilian-led government. But standing up against the coup is coming at a significant cost. According to the Sudan's Doctors Committee, at least 43 protesters have been killed so far. Although some detained officials were released after Prime Minister Hamdock was reinstated, many people are still imprisoned. Journalists and health workers are among those who have been targeted. The political situation in Sudan remains very fluid. We don't know how all this is going to turn out. What is very important, though, is to know how we in the U.S. Congress can be helpful, how we can best support pro-democracy activists, what measures would be constructive and empowering for the people who are putting their lives at risk for genuine civilian-led government. Are we doing enough to pressure the leaders of authoritarian states that may have encouraged the coup, and that even now continue to provide financial and political support to those who led, carried out, and benefit from the coup? Are we coordinating closely enough with our true democratic allies? And how can we protect the progress that was being made towards accountability for past atrocities in Sudan? So I hope these questions will guide our conversation this afternoon. So I want to thank everyone again for being here. I'm now happy to turn this over to my friend and co-chair, Congressman Chris Smith, for any opening remarks that he may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And today's hearing on the human rights implications of the recent coup in Sudan is extremely important and timely. There have been 6 coups since independence in 1956, and for decades, Sudan was dominated by 2 strongmen in particular, Jafar Nimiri, and for 15 years, from 1969 to 85, and Omar al-Bashir, who ruled twice as long, from 89 until being deposed in 2019. Both ruled brutally and cultivated ties with radical Islamists, including most infamously Osama bin Laden, who was given refuge by Bashir. I just would note that in 2005, I met Bashir in Khartoum and engaged him on his atrocious human rights record, in particular with regards to Darfur and the Nuba Mountains. Matter of fact, after meeting with him, I went to Darfur, went to 2 of the camps there, and met with so many people whose lives were ruined, who had loved ones killed, and otherwise hurt, including the systematic use of rape. I found Bashir to be absolutely inflexible with regard to entertaining any reforms, and all he wanted to talk about was sanctions. Thus, I, like many others, greeted with cautious optimism the events of 2019, which led to the ouster of Bashir, while many Sudanese boldly took to the streets of Khartoum and elsewhere and throughout the country to demand democracy and genuine reform. As we all know, a transitional sovereignty council was created pursuant to the draft constitutional declaration, which lasted from August 2019 until the sorry events of this past October, which led to its displacement and dissolution. Yet a closer look revealed warning signs even back in 2019, notably the role of General Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, who planned the Darfur genocide and trained its executioners, and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, better known as Hamedi, who was one of the executioners and was himself indicted for war crimes in Darfur. They remained the power behind the Sovereignty Council. Indeed, the two served as chairman and vice chair and served as a check to ensure that any of the reforms proposed by Prime Minister Hamdock would not threaten their power. Thus, their role in the October 2021 coup should not be a surprise to anyone, just as their cynical role in offering Bashir up as a scapegoat for crimes which they themselves also committed should not surprise anyone. One lesson which can be drawn, however, is that sanctions can be effective in influencing behavior. The removal of Bashir was motivated in large part as an effort to seek the lifting of sanctions, and both Burhan and Hamedi were far more restrained in both 2019 when they played along with efforts to bring reform, albeit cynically, and in 2021 when they appeared to be cognizant of the need to minimize bloodshed. Nonetheless, Burhan and Hamedi, as well as others who remain in their positions, have blood on their hands dating back to the Darfur genocide of 2004, and they need to be held accountable. Indeed, Darfur is very restive at the moment, which is understandable given the ongoing role of Burhan and Hamedi. I want to close by addressing the real hope of Sudan, which is represented by the thousands of Sudanese who have taken to the streets to demand better, to demand a truly democratic government that will protect their rights. I want to thank them for their commitment to democracy. And like them, I hope one day see a Sudan where the Sudanese people live in freedom and respect for human rights. Look forward to your testimonies, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his comments. And now we'll go to our first panel, which is Brian Hunt. Brian Hunt has served as the Office Director for South Sudan and Sudan in the State Department's Bureau of African Affairs since August 2019. He previously served as the Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Africa and the Sudans. Mr. Hunt also served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the American Embassy in Maputo, Mozambique, from August 2016 to July 2019. Deputy Chief of Mission at the American Embassy in Georgetown, Guyana, from August 2013 to July 2016, and is Deputy Chief of Mission at the American Embassy in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, from July 2011 to July 2013. Mr. Hunt, we're happy to have you here, and we will yield the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, and members of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. I'm pleased to speak with you today to talk about the situation in Sudan from here in Khartoum, where I arrived just yesterday for another visit. Since 2018, the Sudanese people have made their demands for a peaceful, prosperous, and democratic Sudan clear. Sudan's fragile transitional process presents an opportunity to achieve their goals. We are steadfastly committed to supporting their democratic aspirations. This begins by calling on Sudanese authorities to respect the human rights and the fundamental freedoms of all in Sudan, including the right to peaceful assembly and freedom of expression. The United States strongly condemned the Sudanese military's October 25th seizure of power and the violence that followed, which resulted in at least 41 deaths and hundreds of injuries. We marshaled the resources of the international community, including our allies of the Troika, the United Kingdom and Norway, our partners in the Friends of Sudan, and our partners in the Quad, the United States, the United Kingdom, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, to underscore the human, geopolitical, and financial costs of the military's actions. We are unwavering in calling on Sudanese authorities to allow peaceful demonstrations as the country's democratic transition comes back on track, to investigate violence, and to hold accountable those responsible for excessive use of force. While imperfect, the November 21st political agreement between Prime Minister Hamdock and Sovereign Council Chair General Burhan represents a first step on the path back to a civilian-led democratic transition. Significant work remains to reverse the democratic and human rights backsliding that occurred since October 25th and the issues that underpinned it. We will continue to press for the implementation of the key elements of the November 21st agreement and the 2019 Constitutional Declaration. Despite the November 21st agreement shortcomings, returning Prime Minister Hamdock to office is a better alternative than a continuation of full military rule, especially given security forces' violent repression of peaceful protests. And the agreement was the result of a Sudanese-led process. We believe the following are immediate priorities in restoring the credibility of Sudan's democratic transition: the release of all those detained in connection with the events of October 25th, the lifting of the state of emergency, the appointment of a credible civilian cabinet of ministers of Prime Minister Hamdock's choosing, and an end to violence against peaceful protesters. We are also pressing for the military and sovereign council to adhere to their pledge to not interfere in cabinet operations and for renewed dialogue to expand the inclusivity of the transitional process, including through a constitutional conference. At the same time, we will continue to press all parties to move forward with critical transitional tasks, including formation of the Constitutional Court and other judicial bodies, formation of the Transitional Legislative Assembly, transfer of the Sovereign Council chairmanship to a civilian no later than July 2022, preparations for elections in late 2023 or early 2024, accountability for the violence against peaceful protesters and other human rights violations and abuses, and the reconstitution of the dismantling committee with appropriate judicial safeguards. We are deeply concerned about recurrent intercommunal violence, human rights violations and abuses, and risks of atrocities in Darfur and other conflict-affected regions. Local level violence has increased since the October 25th military takeover, especially in Darfur. Sudanese authorities will need to redouble efforts, both to provide security to civilians and to address root causes of violence through implementation of the commitments made under the Juba Peace Agreement, including, importantly, security sector reform. The presence of armed militias linked to Juba Peace Agreement signatories in Khartoum is gravely concerning and has been a source of continued instability in the aftermath of the military takeover. These forces need to be withdrawn immediately, and the demobilization and integration process spelled out in the Juba Peace Agreement needs to move forward. We warmly welcome strong public statements and proposed legislation from Congress in support of a civilian-led transition to democracy in Sudan. We look forward to continuing our close working relationship with Congress on assistance for Sudan, including through meeting any notification and consultation requirements. We would request that any legislation introduced allows the department appropriate flexibility to provide expanded assistance at an appropriate time in this transition, if and when we determine conditions merit, working closely with the relevant committees. We thank the Commission for bringing attention to the situation in Sudan. The United States wants to see Sudan succeed, and we will continue to support the Sudanese people's desire for peace, freedom, and prosperity.
Well, thank you very much. I just have a few questions, and then I'm sure Mr. Smith will have some questions as well. You mentioned marshaling the resources of the Quad, U.S., UK, Saudi Arabia, UAE, to underscore the human, geopolitical, and financial costs of the Sudanese military's actions. And I've seen public statements. I've seen public statements from the Quad countries already. But some observers have argued that the UAE, in particular, and Egypt, have been supporting the military's action. So how do you respond to those arguments?
Mr. Chairman, let me start with the United Arab Emirates. We've worked very closely with the UAE as part of the Quad. They have been a supporter through the Friends of Sudan of the transition that was initiated in Sudan since 2019. We have seen the United Arab Emirates stand with us in the Friends of Sudan in trying to assist the transitional government in bringing financial resources to bear to support the economic reforms that were critical in Sudan. As far as the allegations that the United Arab Emirates has not been as supportive of the Sudanese people's demand for democracy as what some would like to see, I would defer. Each person is, of course, entitled to their own opinion. I can tell you from my experience working with the United Arab Emirates leadership that we have found them to be supportive of the international community's desire to see a democratic transition in Sudan. They were supportive of the civilian leadership when it was in power during the days of the transition prior to October 25th. And since October 25th, in the multiple conversations I've had with the United Arab Emirates leadership, I've found them to be very supportive of trying to restore the democratic transition and quite acutely aware of the potential instability that a military takeover in Sudan would pose for not just the Horn of Africa, but for the greater Red Sea region. Egypt, of course, is not a part of the Quad. It is a member of the Friends of Sudan. It has participated in the meetings of the Friends of Sudan. We've had an active dialogue with the Egyptian authorities, underscoring very strongly the United States' view that a military leadership of whatever form in Sudan will not be able to bring stability to the country. That is a premise on which two successive U.S. administrations have strongly agreed, and that we have to see a democratic transition take place in Sudan in order for there to be any hope of stability in Egypt's southern neighbor. I would leave it to the Egyptian government to characterize how it has received the messages that the United States has communicated to them on this score. But we have been, I can assure you, Mr. Chairman, very clear in our views that we must see the democratic transition take place in Sudan, and we have encouraged the Egyptian government to provide support to that transition and to work closely with the international community to make it succeed.
Thank you. You argue that the November 21st political agreement that reinstated Prime Minister Hamdock represents a first step on the path back to a civilian-led democratic transition. And obviously that was an agreement that was negotiated with the military. But as I expect we will hear from the next panel, many in civil society understandably feel betrayed by the coup. They want nothing more to do with the military and don't want to return to the status quo ante. So how do you respond to their concerns and arguments?
I think, Mr. Chairman, their concerns are very valid. We share many of their concerns and disappointment with with the events that took place on October 25th. I think that at this stage in Sudan's history, we all need to look at how we can move forward and put a democratic transition back within the grasp of the Sudanese people. From my perspective, from the perspective of the State Department, the first step in that process was restoring Prime Minister Hamdock to office. It is not the only step. It is not a definitive step. It does not mean that there are not significant challenges ahead. There are a host of things that will need to be done both by the military leadership and by the civilian leadership to restore faith in the transition that was lost, not just by the international community, but more importantly by the Sudanese people. We believe that some of those initial steps need to include the release of all of those detained. As you and your colleague have cited in your opening remarks, the releases that we have seen to date do not represent the full spectrum of detainees that were held by the security forces in the aftermath of the October 25th military takeover. and we need to see those individuals released and allowed to resume their liberty. We absolutely have to see the lifting of the state of emergency. That is a significant deterrent for being able to move forward with the transition, with the elections, with allowing political voices to be heard in Sudan. We think when that lifting occurs, it will be an important sign of an attempt to rebuild some degree of confidence with the Sudanese people. We feel very strongly that it will be important for all political leaders in Sudan to begin a process of national dialogue and consultation, as called for in the Constitutional Declaration, to move towards a normal constitutional order and to lay the groundwork for the elections, which are in fact the end goal of this transitional period. I understand the frustration that many feel here in Sudan with the events that have transpired. And I am also grateful for the fact that they continue to make their voices heard very loudly on the streets here and to maintain a continuous stream of support for broader democracy in their country. Ultimately, their actions, I think, are what are going to drive this transition forward to a successful conclusion. And we should all be incredibly grateful for the work that they have done and that they continue to do. And I think that what we can do as the international community is to try to give them a framework where there is the best chance of success. And from our perspective, restoration of Prime Minister Hamdock, restoration of a civilian cabinet, offers the best possible opportunity for Sudan to reach that end state of free and fair elections so that the Sudanese people can finish this transitional process with success and see the very badly needed political, economic, and societal reforms that they have been clamoring for since 2018.
Well, thanks. And just one final round of questioning here. You provided, and I thank you for this, a pretty comprehensive list of next steps to restore the credibility of Sudan's democratic transition. What incentives is the administration considering or providing to the military to move forward on the task that you lay out? I mean, what hinges on progress? I'm trying to figure out how do you enforce these next steps and just, you know, what are the consequences of not having a Senate confirmed ambassador to Sudan as this crisis unfolds?
Mr. Chairman, I think to your first question, the decision that was taken by the administration to pause much of our foreign assistance to Sudan was a vital one. The fact that that was complemented almost immediately by decisions in European capitals, by decisions at the international financial institutions, by decisions at the Paris Club to take similar steps was a strong and ultimately decisive message to the military leadership that we were not going to tolerate its attempt to derail the transition. That sort of fiscal pressure is a key element that we were able to use and that we can continue to use as we try to help the Sudanese people and the restored civilian leadership be able to exercise the authorities that they should in the country. We've been clear that we are going to determine the future of our relationship with Sudan based upon how the democratic trajectory of the country moves forward. We will be closely reviewing all of our previous assistance programming to determine what should move forward and when it should move forward and how it should move forward. We're engaged very actively with the international financial institutions and our international partners in doing the same thing with their financial assistance to the transition. And I don't think the importance of that can be understated. I also think it's vitally important in many ways that we simply continue to give voice to what's happening in Sudan. The fact that we, our international partners, the African Union, the Arab League, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, the United Nations, have all spoken out very clearly about expectations, about what the international community wants to see, and more importantly, has spoken with a unified voice in support of the Sudanese people's own demands, is going to continue to be a critical aspect as we try to drive this transition forward. As you know, Mr. Chairman, from having worked on these issues for many years, there are no guarantees in a transition. They are always difficult. The chance of success is always one that we as the international community have to fight for. It's one that we have to work very closely with our international partners on, and one that we have to work very closely with the people of the country concerned on. And Sudan, of course, is no exception. In fact, it may be in a much more difficult place than some because of the damage that was done under General Bashir. To your question about a Senate confirmed ambassador, I think it is very important that we have Senate confirmed nominees in all of our diplomatic posts. It is never an ideal situation when we have a situation where we have a prolonged vacancy, and the administration certainly is working to identify an appropriate nominee to send forward for our diplomatic post here in Khartoum at the earliest possible opportunity.
Thank you. I'll yield to Co-Chair Smith. He was there a second ago.
Off on its own.
There you go.
Thank you very much, Director Hunt, for your leadership and testimony today. Thank you so very much. I just had a couple of questions. At least two of the coup leaders, General Burhan and Hamedi, obviously were implicated in very, very serious human rights abuses. And I'm wondering, in retrospect, if you thought that we tolerated their role in the Sovereignty Council, was it a good idea or not? Since they themselves have allegedly, and I think there's a body of evidence, committed crimes against humanity. And what should we do now regarding that? Secondly, if you could speak to whether or not some additional sanctions would be warranted. Where are we in terms of the decision-making process on that? Is it being actively looked at? What's in place? Is that enough? What do you think ought to be done? And then, Mr. Adam, one of our witnesses in the second panel, points out and highlights in his testimony that whoever is the president of Sudan, or whatever agreements are in place, it's the same hardline military leaders who exercise an outsized influence on Sudanese politics. And I'm wondering, how can that tether be broken with regards to who really calls the shots there? I appreciate your thoughts on that. And finally, regards to the faith community, are the faith-based leadership, Muslim, Christian, others, are they involved in this dialogue to try to keep violence, mitigate violence, and hopefully get to a place where people can live in peace and tranquility? So if you could speak to their role as well, I appreciate it.
Of course, Chairman Smith, I will try to take your questions one at a time. If I forget any, please feel free to chime in. I think to your first question about the involvement of General Burhan and General Hamedi in the Sovereign Council, I am a firm believer in the idea that the people of a country need to make decisions about their leadership. There was a series of negotiations that happened in 2018, 2019, between first the military leadership under Bashir, then the Transitional Military Council, and the Forces for Freedom and Change. They arrived at what they felt was going to be a workable agreement between the two parties. The African Union was heavily involved in helping them to come to an agreement that both sides believed would be workable. As you know, no agreement gives everyone everything that they would like to see. There are always compromises that are made. Our role as the international community, once that agreement was signed, was to support the civilian-led transition. We did that fully aware of Sudan's long history, fully aware of the role that the Sudanese security forces have played throughout the country's history. And we did that, I think, in good faith with the idea that our assistance could help the civilian leaders, the FFC, Prime Minister Hamdock, the numerous other political parties, begin to rebalance the power equation in Sudan. You know, as we have said to the military here in Sudan, they should not be choosing the civilian leaders of this country. They should not be choosing their civilian partners. There was an agreement with the FFC. They have issues with the FFC. In the same vein, the civilian leadership of this country made a decision that they were going to work with the military leadership of the country that was in place. I would not be so bold as to criticize the decisions that the Sudanese political leadership made in that course of negotiations. So I think it's for them to have made those decisions. As we move forward, I think there are a number of questions, and I think that whether Sudan achieves its democratic transition is going to depend very heavily on how the civilian leadership is able to exercise power, whether it is able to move forward on things like accountability, which are absolutely key to resolving a number of issues in this country, Darfur being one of many conflicts, as you know, that took place over time. And I think it's going to be absolutely vital that they find ways that are acceptable to the Sudanese people to ensure that justice happens. Justice was one of the hallmarks of the street protests of 2018 and 2019. It's been a consistent theme throughout the transitional period, and it's one that there's going to need to be significant focus on as Sudanese move forward. But I think we in the international community have to give the Sudanese actors the space to determine how they wish to move forward, what will be acceptable within their society on that particular front. To the question of the same military leaders pulling the strings, I would hope that the reforms that were started in 2019, both on the economic and the political side, began to tilt that equation more in favor, or maybe not in favor of, but in a more equitable way, a more appropriate way with civilians as they moved into a democratic election and into a democratic government, because change will need to happen. We all recognize that a military plays an important role in a society, including in a democratic society. But there are norms and there are ways in which those institutions need to play their role, and they need to play within their defined parameters. And obviously, changing from a system where the military was governing directly under Bashir to one in which, hopefully, after the elections in 2024, we will have a fully civilian-led democratic government here. There's going to need to be a change in that relationship. And again, it's going to be a change that the Sudanese are going to need to begin to negotiate. I think the Juba Peace Agreement was a start. There's a lot of work that needs to be done still to implement all of those provisions. I think the Constitutional Declaration was a start. I think the fact that they reaffirmed the need for a single unified military in the November 21st agreement is a start. And now it becomes a question of how all of this gets implemented going forward. And we in the international community should continue to encourage an implementation of these items in a way that lays the foundation for the military to play its appropriate role in a future democratic state. And finally, to your question about the faith communities, Sudan is a country that has religious diversity. That religious diversity has not always been appropriately recognized by the leadership. We all know the horrors that happened under Bashir. Prime Minister Hamdock, I think, prior to October 25th, made a good faith effort to change that, to welcome back into dialogue the Christian communities here in Sudan, minority Muslim communities here in Sudan, other faith communities in Sudan. Are they playing a role? Absolutely. There is no question that the leadership of the faith communities here have played and continue to play an absolutely critical role in the civil society movement that has underpinned the entire transition. First in 2018, many times under tremendous repression from General Bashir, through the 2019-2020 period, even now into the 2021 period. I think it's important that we continue to speak out as the international community to make sure that religious freedom is protected, that those faith community leaders and all other civil society leaders have the ability to drive and influence policy in the country. And I do think that in Prime Minister Hamdock, we have a strong and vocal ally. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to help empower him to be able to ensure that critical role for faith communities is respected as we move into the next chapter of Sudan's history.
Real quick, Mr. Hunt, in terms of the ambassador, who would that be? Is there somebody that's a couple of people at the top of the list, and how long has that been vacant?
But as you know, Congressman, we did not have an ambassador in Sudan for many years under
When I
Bashir.
visited with Bashir, the DCM went with me. Exactly.
Yes, we had serious issues with the government at the time, and it was felt appropriate to downgrade. That was a decision that was made. I believe it was September of 2019, the last administration made a decision that it wanted to reestablish relationships at the ambassadorial level. As you know, Sudan's process moved very quickly. They were able to appoint Ambassador Sadi to Washington. We've been very happy to have him there. Our internal processes move more slowly and more deliberatively. The last administration before leaving office never reached the point where it had a nominee that it was prepared to present to the Senate. The new administration has restarted the necessary processes. That, of course, is a White House decision. It is not one that my office is involved in. So unfortunately, I can't really give you a status as to who's under consideration or where that process will go. But I do know from talking with colleagues at the White House and on the National Security Council that we are committed to moving forward and to sending an appropriately qualified nominee to the Senate.
Very good. Thank you again for your leadership. Appreciate it.
Thank you for yours, Chairman.
Thank you. I think Congresswoman Cori Bush. See if she's. Oh, okay. We'll just give us a second here, and then we just double check. Zoom is wonderful, except if someone steps away from it for a second, then you can't. Okay, I don't know. I see Congressman Andy Harris. I don't know if he has any questions.
No, I don't, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thanks for being with us. I think that's it for the panelists. To have any questions for you, Mr. Hunt, we want to thank you for being with us, and we will continue to communicate with you as things develop further. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your time today.
Okay. Now we go to our next panel. Jonas Horner joined the crisis group in October 2019 as Deputy Director for Horn of Africa and Senior Analyst for Sudan. Mr. Horner has policy, programs, and research experience in conflict management, stabilization, and small arms and light weapons in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, and the Pacific with UN agencies, the European Union, NGOs, and research organizations. In Sudan, he worked as technical advisor on politics, stabilization, and peace building to the EU for 4 years and ran the UN Development Program's conflict reduction program along the border with South Sudan ahead of the 2011 division of the countries. Monaim Adam is a Sudanese lawyer by training and the manager and project director for the Sudanese Archives. Mr. Adam graduated with his LLM in Public International Law and Human Rights from Riga Graduate School of Law in 2017. He has worked as a human rights lawyer before domestic courts, supporting local NGOs, and served as a legal advisor and a consultant for international organizations, particular the interim government. Holud Hare is managing partner of Insight Strategies Partners, a think tank, and do tank in Khartoum that works on transitional policy priority areas. Ms. Hare is also host and co-produces Spotlight 249, Sudan's first English language political discussion and debate show aimed at young Sudanese. She holds a Master's of Science from Oxford University and another from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Mausi Shegun is Executive Director of Human Rights Watch's Africa Division. Shegun first joined Human Rights Watch in September 2013 as the senior researcher for Nigeria. She's conducted field investigations and written dispatches for Human Rights Watch on the cycles of violence in north central Nigeria, the humanitarian crises, the abduction of girls and women, and the violations committed by both sides in the Boko Haram insurgency in the Northeast. She has published pieces in the New York Times, The Independent, UK, Sunday Independent Essay, and so on. Before Human Rights Watch, she worked with Nigeria's National Human Rights Commission. So thank you all for being here. Mr. Horner, we'll begin with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to address the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission and to discuss the critical situation in Sudan. International Crisis Group is a global organization committed to the prevention, mitigation, and resolution of deadly conflict. It is in this spirit of our conflict prevention mission that I hope to speak to you today. As the members of this commission know, Sudan's 2019 popular uprising ousted Omar al-Bashir after 30 years of autocratic rule and set the stage for the country's transitional process. However, the October 25 military coup violently interrupted Sudan's halting progress towards constitutionally mandated elections in 2024. On November 21, the deposed Prime Minister of the civilian transitional government, Abdullah Hamdock, and General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, Sudan's military chief who heads the interim sovereign council and who led the military coup, signed an agreement reinstating Hamdock as prime minister. The agreement purports to take Sudan back to the constitutional arrangements agreed upon after the 2019 revolution, but appears to hand control previously given to a civilian cabinet to a sovereign council newly stocked with the military and Islamist figures formerly close to Bashir. Negotiations to clarify implementation of the agreement under these dubious auspices are ongoing. Even before the agreement was signed, the military had drastically altered the composition of the Sovereign Council, the transitional government's executive body headed both before and after the coup by General Burhan, in their favor. The political agreement codifies the coup in a range of ways, most egregiously by taking key constitutionally endowed powers away from the cabinet and handing those powers to a newly formed Sovereign Council, now stocked with military Bashir-era loyalists and military figures. Those powers include holding members of the Bashir regime to account for past crimes, carrying out legal reforms, addressing the country's economic crisis, promoting women's rights, creating mechanisms to establish a permanent constitution, and making foreign policy. With the military's hold on power now reinforced, a combination of strong Sudanese and international pressure will be needed to get the transition back on track. This agreement, flawed as it is, does provide a starting point for the international engagement. In particular, Prime Minister Hamdock, as the most senior civilian in the new government, will require backing from Sudanese and international quarters to lead efforts to secure readmission of the FFC into the government and to credibly represent the views of the Sudanese protest movement during the transition. To that end, the United States has an important role to play in leading the international community's response to the crisis and in trying to help ensure the success of the transition. The US should seek the military's fulfillment of verifiable actions demonstrating the security forces' willingness to adhere to commitments it has made in the 2019 Constitution. These could include transfer of control of police and intelligence services to civilian oversight or auditing of key military-owned enterprises. US diplomatic efforts should also continue to focus on the regional engagement with key neighbors and states with vested interests and long-standing ties to Sudan's leaders, both military and civilian. It should insist that its partners publicly and privately provide Hamdock and the civilian transition leaders with rhetorical and diplomatic support. It's important to point out that external partners backing Sudan's transition, like the US, retain some points of influence with the military. Key partners like the World Bank and the IMF, who have been engaged in Sudan's debt relief efforts, could, in coordination with a set of key bilateral donors, and led by the United States, tie the renewal of resumption of assistance to a conditions-based assessment of the transition's progress. In particular, they should focus on independent and unobstructed civilian leadership and the reversal of unconstitutional steps taken during the military takeover. There remains a very real risk that the military will revert to repressive measures to reinforce their grip on a dynamic and unpredictable situation. In anticipation of such a possibility, the United States should register the threat of sanctions programs targeting key figures in the military to incentivize a shift in behavior and to indicate the seriousness of US intent to return Sudan to a path towards democracy. These sanctions could be triggered by the Sudanese military missing transitional milestones and could provide a framework for incremental escalation if circumstances warrant. The United States should also seek to coordinate such financial pressures on the military with the European Union and other like-minded governments. International efforts to date aimed at shifting the thinking and decision-making of Sudan's military leaders have so far produced meager results. The current context, with the security forces in the ascendancy, yet finding strident opposition from a determined street, suggests that some form of accommodation will be required, likely involving external guarantors. While far from assured of success, the United States remains uniquely positioned to marshal regional and international support for such diplomatic efforts and should now focus on bringing to bear real pressure on Sudan's coup leaders. Continuation down this undemocratic path of military dominance will only produce instability and violence. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear for the committee today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We're going to go to Ms. Hare next.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, members of the Commission, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Khulud Khair, and I'm Managing Partner, Research and Analyst at Insight Strategy Partners, a think tank we founded to support the democratic transition in Sudan. Before I start, I'd like to express appreciation for this timely discussion on human rights in Sudan and to welcome greater international attention on this issue at this particular political juncture. 25th of October coup was in many ways a natural consequence of the failure of the civilian and military partnership. We've been here before, throughout successive transitions in Sudan's history, and this is the third. The winner-takes-all transactional politics that is a key feature in Sudanese political landscape has meant that true partnership between civilian and military forces, and even within these forces, is a challenge. Following the 21st of November agreement, there is little to indicate that this time around there is a chance of a successful civilian-military venture. If anything, it is now more elusive. Again, we've been here before. Mass detentions, killings, appointments of Islamists to key positions such as Chief Justice and across the security organs are reminiscent of the aftermath of the 1989 coup by ICC indictee Omar al-Bashir. That this rulebook today is being so diligently followed, with little space for civilians in government to counter this, means that state repression looks set to intensify and diversify and not diminish. The resistance committees, the remarkably resolute and durable pro-democracy movement, knows this. They have kept domestic pressure on the military and borne the brunt of state repression. They have evolved from a mobilizing force to a movement where the most meaningful politics takes place, away from the well-worn transactional zero-sum approach towards building tools of consensus and coalition building. By cultivating agile, enduring, and responsive political resistance in the face of political infighting, violent suppression, and economic decline, they have evolved to become the best safeguard against the closing and policing of civic space. In Sudan's fluid political situation, amorphous, broad civic movements such as the resistance committees are hard for policymakers to read, and the urge is to trust in agreements, no matter how poorly they support civilian bodies, no matter how they embolden the aggressors, and no matter how much they delay or erase potential for accountability, all seemingly in the name of stability. But what is increasingly clear is that stability cannot take root while the public continue on a determined quest for full civilian rule. But more importantly, while the predatory and extractive power structures of Sudan, chief of which is the military, remains in place. Relatedly, military government will only increase resistance through armed means and actors. Fueling conflict and instability in Sudan's peripheries is a long-standing strategy from the narrowly defined elite in Sudan's center, allowing them to continue extracting resources. Similarly, the current overwhelmingly peaceful nature of the resistance movement may not last if it reaps few rewards, and former rebels turned putschists may soon realize their long-term objectives and that of their new military partners put them on a collision course. The release of the Prime Minister was predominantly an international demand, met in order to please international actors and restore financial support. The military have followed through with this bare minimum with the expectation that they will not be asked to proffer more. The pro-democracy groups have always called for and continue to call for freedom, peace, and justice through the pursuit of full civilian rule. That such demands were not factored into messaging by the international community to the military after the coup may have been a missed opportunity to get more concessions and support a process of managed withdrawal of the military from political life. Instead, we currently have an agreement that takes us back to military hegemony. In the meantime, political instability for Prime Minister Hamdock can only be possible. Political stability for him can only be possible through a stronger civilian bloc, which currently does not exist, leaving him exposed to pressure from his military partners. The experience of Afghanistan state building shows that international support for a civilian leader with little domestic support is the surest weapon Islamists can have to re-engineer a comeback. That is what Sudan is experiencing today. It behooves the United States and other international stakeholders to support grassroots efforts as a means of engendering lasting stability in Sudan, as well as put the country back on track towards civilian-led democracy. The international community is planning on setting benchmarks for the transition. This needs to be done independently of the 21st of November agreement, whose framework only serves to entrench the Islamo military regime. More importantly, it needs to be done with political groups on the ground, parties, unions, and resistance committees, with these domestic groups taking the lead to ensure that the broad swathe of civilian priorities can be met, and from the outset. In addition, strong monitoring systems of transitional priority areas, particularly peace, economic reform, and adherence to human rights, as well as accountability mechanisms for transitional justice and money flows, placed in direct relation to international support, will engage the regime by leveraging key pressure points. The US is not currently well positioned to engage meaningfully in Sudan. It could be. It would require, first and foremost, a Sudan strategy that links together the efforts of Congress, the State Department, the White House, the National Security Council, etc. Secondly, a larger, stronger team at the embassy in Khartoum is vital if the US is to meaningfully engage with myriad pro-democracy forces and undo the crisis of consultation that persists. In the interest of time, the last thing I'll mention for now is the urgent appointment of an ambassador, one that is well-versed in political complexity or transitions, and that will bring patience and principle to the role, away from a security approach currently favored by regional supporters of the regime. The US and the international community have an opportunity to be on the right side of history on Sudan's future. I sincerely hope this opportunity is taken. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Adam.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is I'm Adam. I'm the project director of Sudanese Archive. Sudanese Archive is an organization works supporting documentation and preservation of the human rights violation happening in Sudan. It was established since 2018, and since that time been publishing and documenting and archiving a huge data connected to human rights violation that happened in Sudan. By that, I would first of all would salute all the people suffered from human rights violation across the globe, and in particular the people from Sudan who happened to be victims of violation happened because of the current military and the former government that exists for in Sudan for over the last 3 decades. First of all, I wanted just to give a background for like what's happening, how we can see that. The current situation in Sudan there is a strong indication of a hidden coalition between the military and the former regime, the National Congress and the NCP, which that in alliance with the regional forces that are supporting the current military. The coalition is fiercely against establishing a democratic state in Sudan. They are actively working against implementing the rule of law the rule of law and protecting human rights in Sudan. And these indications, we can read them through the following points. The coup leaders, the coup leaders organize themselves with the generals, the NCP members, Juba Peace Agreement members, and they act exactly against the democracy forces. The military leaders are insisting to be part of the political practice since the first revolution in Sudan in 2018. Against all effort, all the military have been standing against all effort of accountability, including the incident on June 3rd, and including as well the effort that done for run by the ICC for the Darfur international crimes. The military are always against all these kind of accountability mechanisms, and they never always act against all the efforts to bring about justice for those incidents as well. The military, the last indication for this part, the military are always acting against all the reforms for the military institutions. And they did, especially for the National Intelligence and Security Services, they changed the name and they changed the faces, but the practice remained the same. And we saw that after the coup happened, how they acted in a very aggressive way against the civilian protesters, where that exactly shows the link between the former regime, how they acted aggressively against the peaceful protest in Sudan. How we read the agreement between Hamdock and between the generals, I think there is no any connection that could help Hamdock to be as well represented the street how it used to be. He lost all the connections between with the FFC and with the neighbor committees, where that he left having a deal with the military. Furthermore, as well, Burhan and Hemeti, they mentioned in particular, before even Hamdock came out, they mentioned in particular how they had a deal with Hamdock, and he was supposed to announce with them together the coup, but he was reluctant to do so. But after that, so that shows Hamdock is not representing the civilians, he's not representing the technocrat, but he is representing as well the military. And as Sudanese Archive now, we're collecting a huge data, over 3,000 pieces that shows the aggressive act of the government, the joint forces. They work in harmony, how to tackle the demonstration, the peaceful demonstrations, use of force. They killed more than, how it was mentioned earlier, more than 45 people died now, according to the Central Doctors Committee in Sudan. That shows the military, and including Hamdock as well, with his later deals that signed early this last month, in the middle of last month. It doesn't have any connection to represent the streets. It doesn't have any connection to represent democracy or the prosperity for the Sudanese people. And we have as well what has happened without the constitutional document, how the military, they don't have any authority to change the constitutional document. They don't have any authority to have a deal with Juba Peace Agreement and with Hamdock as well. Hamdock has no power as well without having the FFC as a political hub for him. So that shows Hamdock as part of the military coup now. He is part of the military, but he's no longer representing the democratic and a civilian-led government. By that being said, I strongly stand with the support of targeted sanctions in order to isolate the military leaders, in order to isolate their businesses, in order to isolate as well the connected companies with them in the Gulf countries, mentioned in particularly in Emirat, the UAE. If just we look into the report of this, the Central Bank of Sudan, it shows the gold is sold mainly in the UAE, or the big chunk of that, around 80% of it goes to the UAE. I guess that is what's supposed to be part of the military, that's supposed to be part of the tracking system of the targeted sanctions. To follow the RSF leaders, SAF leaders, including Burhan, including Hemeti, that as well, to pressure them to release all the political detainees, to restore all the civilian-led government and to go back to the barracks and to leave the military, to leave the civilians to lead the government, how it's like led by how the street now is calling for a civilian-led government without any power sharing, without any compromises, and even without going back to the situation before the coup. The Sudanese people, they deserve better, and the international community has a chance now to support them and to stand with their side as peaceful demonstrators go to street asking for peace, asking for justice, but that is not done, and the military is working and is stopping behind this, and now I think that the chance for the international community, led by the US, or the international community as well, and the US separately, could lead these targeted sanctions to stop the killing of people, peaceful protesters in Sudan, and to help establishing a rule of law in Sudan and the democracy. Since the coup happened until today, the state of emergency is declared. People are denied medical care. People are denied to enjoy all the human rights. And I think this is a chance for Burhan himself and Hemeti to be part of that targeted sanctions. The military in Sudan, they understand how to play with this, to play the tactics in order to delay to transfer the lead to civilians, and that happened with Bashir. He was delaying that for 30 years, and then at the end he's now in the jail, but the military actually blocking him from being transferred to the ICC after negotiated by the ICC in early September. I think it is. I strongly support all the international community to coordinate in order to isolate the current leaders for the coup, in order to isolate them from being connected with Islamist groups, being affiliated with Russian who are having benefit from the mining in Sudan, blocking them from as well using the businesses in making crisis for the civilian-led government when it will happen. Thank you so much, and I'll be happy to respond to questions.
So thank you. Now, I just want to make an announcement. So as you know, as fate would have it here, we just got called for a series of 5 votes, which is obviously not a good thing right now. So we're going to have, so this is what I'm going to propose we do. Ms. Shagan, we're going to go to you and you're going to testify. I will be able to listen as we walk to our votes. And then the other good news is that I have an office in the Rules Committee, which is right off the floor. So we can continue this conversation then. So when you're done, we'll just hold tight for a few minutes until we get back on the line, and then we'll go right into questions. I know this is an inconvenience, but I think we can work this out. And I see Congresswoman Bush on the phone. You're more than welcome to join me in the Rules Committee if it's convenient, because I know there's a series of votes here, and that goes for Mr. Smith and Mr. Harris, who is also on the line. So we're going to go to Ms. Shagun right now, and then when you're done, there'll be maybe a little bit of silence for a few minutes, but we're not going anywhere. It's just we're running up to the Rules Committee to be able to engage you more directly in questions. So I apologize for the inconvenience, but I think we'll work this out. So we will go to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights
I think we may be having a little bit of a
Committee,
difficult. Ms. Shagun, if you could just,
and other members of the committee, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in today's briefing on Sudan.
I think we may.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, but you were echoing, so I'm just want to make sure we get.
Do you hear me now?
I can hear you beautifully now. Thank you.
Hear you.
Okay. You may continue.
Do you hear me?
Yes, it's good. Yes.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you. Right. Thank you again for inviting me to participate in this briefing. This text definitely could not down for that tightens its grip on Sudan's politics. Repression continues and the chances for meaningful reform diminish. In February last year, a high-level team from Human Rights Watch, victims' family groups in Khartoum, who said poignantly, the major obstacle to securing justice for our martyrs during the 2018 and 2019 protests is the fact that the people who committed those crimes are the ones in power today. More than 20 months on, many Sudanese are still reeling, again, like those grieving families as a result of the country's security forces' ruthless clampdown on protests. As the last month has painfully shown us, the historical tolerance for repression and abuse in Sudan remains in place, including among some of Sudan's regional and international partners, and has forced resolute Sudanese people to repeatedly put their lives on the line by taking to the streets. The US Congress has a key role to play in ensuring that going forward, US foreign policy doesn't contribute to creating an environment that forces the people who have sacrificed so much to accept that progress towards the reforms the country desperately needs is yet a mirage. Congress has a key role to play in ensuring that the Biden administration does not accept a return to business as usual in Sudan's political configuration that makes key reforms impossible. Since the October 25 military coup, Sudan's tenacious protesters have repeatedly taken to the streets across many towns to express their discontent with the coup. Following the November 21 deal among the military, Juba peace agreement signatories and Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdock, they have demonstrated against the new political dispensation. Government forces have responded with excessive force, including lethal force against demonstrators. Human Rights Watch research, as well as reporting from doctors' groups in Khartoum, found that between the 25th October coup and November 21, security forces have killed at least 44 people, including 5 children, injured hundreds, and arbitrarily detained dozens. Not only government officials, but also journalists and protesters. The deadliest clampdown so far was on November 17, when police and other security forces used excessive lethal force against largely peaceful protesters, killing 16 people. Autopsies carried out on 11 of those killed showed that they had been shot in the upper body, half of them in the head. Medical reports said that 107 were wounded on that day alone, including 48 reportedly due to live ammunition. Witnesses described to us how tear gas canisters were used without warning as a weapon. Doctors' group said that 13 people received at hospitals had wounds from direct hits of tear gas canisters. For a month, the military authorities disrupted the internet and mobile and text-based communications, hampering real-time reporting. Sudan's military leaders have continued to seek to obscure these abuses and crimes and to create a semblance of restoration of normalcy. Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, the military chief, and his deputy, Hemeti, have sought to downplay the military's role and responsibility in the deadly clampdowns, with al-Burhan saying killings of protesters may have been committed by elements in police uniforms. On November 27, Prime Minister Hamdock dismissed the police chief and his deputy. However, the violent dispersal of protests has continued. Just yesterday, November 30, protesters outside the presidential palace and in other parts of Khartoum were met with excessive use of force, including live ammunition and tear gas canisters used as weapons against protesters. Police forces have also targeted health facilities on at least 2 occasions in Khartoum in November. They have harassed medical personnel and disrupted medical care to wounded protesters. It remains of great concern that the Sudanese security forces repeatedly fail to follow international standards on the use of force during protests. International human rights law permits the use of tear gas only when protests are violent, and even then, it should be used only as a measure of last resort. Also, from the onset of the coup, the security forces have arbitrarily detained dozens of government officials, including ministers and advisors to the prime minister, as well as hundreds of protesters, protest leaders, and journalists. Together with Amnesty International Human Rights Watch investigated the arrest of 8 political officials in the first days of the coup and found that they were held in undisclosed locations without access to family or legal counsel in circumstances that may amount to enforced disappearances under international human rights law. Some of those recently released as part of the November 21 deal have said that they were detained at a national security academy in Khartoum Soba district. At least 7 detainees, including the former minister, have been charged with sedition and then released with the charges still pending. Human Rights Watch has previously reported on the arbitrary detention of civilians by the RSF in 2020. Following the death of a man in RSF custody in Khartoum in late 2020, the then Attorney General issued a statement that confirmed that the detention of civilians by military forces is unlawful under Sudan's criminal law. So what are the implications of the current political arrangement for human rights? The 14-point deal announced by the military on November 21 returned Hamdock as prime minister. However, while it reaffirms a partnership between civilians and the armed forces, it excludes the Forces for Freedom and Change, FFC, the civilian coalition of political opposition, civil society groups, and professional associations that had played a key part in bringing about the downfall of the long-term dictator Omar al-Bashir in April 2019 and the subsequent replacement of the Transition Military Council by the Joint Civilian Military Sovereign Council in August 2019. The FFC has rejected the November 21 deal. A dozen ministers from Hamdock's cabinet, SWAL cabinet, that is, including Foreign Minister Miriam Al-Mahdi, resigned in protest, citing lack of consultation by Hamdock. Unsurprisingly, the deal has also been rejected by other key protest groups, including the Sudanese Professionals Association and resistance committees. These committees have continued to, in the current political configuration, even if Prime Minister Hamdock is able to appoint a technocratic government, the military will retain preeminence and control of the Sovereign Council, which had been designed under the Constitutional Charter and the Juba Peace Agreement as a collective presidency body composed of both military and civilian leaders. On November 11, the military unilaterally appointed 3 new civilian members in addition to the previously appointed representatives of rebel groups' peace signatories. The November 21 deal pledges to provide investigations into the deaths and injuries of protesters, but also equated the harm done to civilians with that allegedly suffered by security forces. These commitments ring hollow in the face of evidence that previous attempts to hold security forces accountable, including for the killing of at least 120 people under an RSF-led clampdown on a sit-down on June 3rd, 2019, have been hamstrung by the military leadership. It is clear from the angry reactions in Khartoum that protesters on Sudan streets are dissatisfied with the New Deal and see it as nothing more than a consolidation of the military's power. And yet, the deal has been welcomed in many Western capitals and by the US Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, who said that he was encouraged by the deal. Now, I'll quickly go to some of the issues that Congress, on which Congress can play an important role. It would be fundamentally wrong to jettison or expect the Sudanese people to accept less reform in the name of political expediency at this time. The US Congress has a key role to play in preventing a return to business as usual in Sudan and to ensure that there is no rollback on progress made so far. Congress should continue to call for the release of all political detainees, including all those detained because of their peaceful participation in demonstrations. It should continue to raise concerns around the military's decision to press charges against government officials. Congress should call for the US administration's policy and responses to developments in Sudan to reflect, acknowledge, and be supportive of the wishes of the Sudanese people as represented by the country's civil society groups and broad-based protest movements. Congress should press the Biden administration to urge Sudanese authorities to ensure that peaceful protests are allowed to take place without fear of repression. Congress should call for accountability for recent and past serious abuses by members of security forces, including the SAF, Sudanese Armed Forces, the RSF, and the police. Congress should press for the assessment of what the US has done and what more it could do going forward to support aspects of the reform agenda. Sudanese reformers will not accept and should not be forced to accept less. Congress should make clear that the US will consider restrictive measures so that key reform agendas are implemented. The families of those killed in recent weeks and in previous years deserve to see international partners help protect them and promote their efforts for justice and disavow impunity and further repression. The Sudanese people deserve no less. Thank you.
Yes, hi. Currently, there are votes and the members of the commission are voting. So we're going to take a brief recess until they return. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Let me begin by saying several of you have emphasized the importance of continuing to pressure for accountability for those responsible for grave human rights crimes and war crimes in the past, a position that I share. Yet some argue that fear of accountability was one of the factors that led to the coup. How do you respond to that argument? And anybody who want, I mean, that's a question that any of you or all of you or can answer if you would like. Just let me know who wants to speak. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would like to say this is one of the things as well. Actually, the same question led to Bashir stays for so long because of that pressure as well. But the pressure when is like not very well organized in order to. I mean, like the military now, they halfway in which how to deal with the situation. Like they dismantled the June 3rd committee. They didn't let that the report out. Now it's almost 2 years and a half. And as well, the same thing happened with the ICC deal. They never wanted to surrender Bashir, and they stated that in their videos, like their videos for the military. They stated that. So I think it's important to pressure and to ask for accountability, which is that's the right for the human rights violation happened, and that pressure is supposed just to as well to help to tighten their relationship around that, so they cannot get any support from the region, they cannot get any support from other parts.
Ms. Shagun, I think you had your hand up.
I think just to add to what Monem has said, it is without a doubt that the military leadership in particular is concerned about the implications for them, especially the leadership of the RSF, the leadership of the army, when it comes to accountability for the crimes that have been committed, not only in the past, but in the last 2 years of the transition, including the June 3rd protests Hamdock. There has to be a clear message that accountability is not is sacrosanct, and that the line for the military, it would be there would be a personal cost if there is no accountability for these abuses, and impunity is not acceptable. Now, with the position they hold, holding on to power to ensure a lack of accountability is not a lasting approach. It is an approach that would not serve them well, and I think that the message has been sent clearly, but by the people on the street in Sudan, and because a major cry of the Sudanese people has been for justice and accountability. There is no running away from it, and that message needs to be supported and clearly and visibly made by the international community in support of the people on the ground. But it has to go beyond just the messaging. It has to go to the point of supporting an agenda, the building of institutions and mechanisms that would ensure that accountability happens. The investigations have happened in many cases, but there has been no follow-through towards prosecution. That is the point that needs to happen. And the message must be clear to the military that the international community would support the mechanisms that would ensure accountability beyond just the rhetorics.
Thank you. Anybody else want to take? Okay, I don't see anybody else.
Yes.
Yes. Oh, Mr. Horn.
Just
Mr.
had
Horn.
his hand up. I'll go after him.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah. The way this is showing on my screen, you're all really small until you speak. So so yeah. So in addition, you can say, "Hey, me too." All right. So we go to Mr. Horner, and then we'll go to Ms. Hare.
Thank you, Chairman. Two small points I would add to this. I mean, one is that it is not, purely accountability and fear, for example, jail or charges that worries people like Hemeti. In my interactions with RSF leadership, Hemeti and his brothers generally, it's much more the dent in legitimacy that comes from being tarred with such charges. That's a real longer term problem for them. This gets in the way of their longer term interests in being part of politics in Sudan longer term. And there's a larger sort of corollary we can talk about that, about messaging to Hemeti or his brother about whether they're eligible at all in the international community's eyes to be leaders of Sudan. Though that of course is ultimately a question for Sudanese. Though more broadly, as I speak to people both in and out of Khartoum, there's a real sort of large scale rejection for Hemeti as a head of state. And then the last thing I would say is that, there certainly have been grand bargains discussed and tabled about how to, perhaps set aside or offer a level of impunity in exchange for the military walking away from this. And that comes down to, fundamental questions that different governments or individuals or analysts may have about whether they can wear that and whether they can, whether they'd rather see Sudan move ahead, from the current, current situation where everyone is locked in against each other. So and various Sudanese, are willing to trade impunity for a move ahead. I have certainly talked to people, to women who have lost, relatives who are willing to say, look, if the military walks away now, we'll forgive them. If they go away to Dubai or wherever they want to go, then that's okay. So there's a diversity of concepts about how justice should be treated in Sudan.
Thank you, Ms. Hare.
I'll just add briefly to that. I mean, I think Mouse's point is very, clear. Transitional justice is inevitable. And I think they learned that through the Bashir experience. He was in power for 30 years and he still didn't manage to avoid it. To Jonas's point about the fact that, transitional justice can look like different things, I think that's true. It looks like the ICC, it looks like domestic courts, it looks like truth and reconciliation commissions, and it also looks like community level transitional justice. There's a whole menu of transitional justice, and part of the problem is that the military leaders don't really understand the complexity of that, and they think it's just the ICC, which also comes with all this reputational cost that Jonas pointed out. So I think there needs to be sort of a closer look into what transitional justice could be and communicating that.
Thank you. So what do we know about the people who are still being detained? How many are there? Where are they, and what is their condition? Do they have access to lawyers? Do their families have access to them? Does anybody want to respond to that? Mr. Adam.
Mainly they released the leaders, the political leaders in Khartoum, and they detained some of them as well. They detained some people in Al-Gadarif, Eastern Sudan. Nobody knows about them so far, as well leaders of FFC. They detain people in Niala, in Darfur as well. Nobody knows about them, anything. And in particular, the people in Niala, they didn't allow their family to visit them. And their names, their locations, and family as well connections. There are some people detained in northern Sudan, and in particular in Atbara. Until I came to this meeting, nobody was knowing any information about them as well. And the leaders, they let out, but the main thing that happens, like some of the resistance committees, nobody knows, they're not public figures, as suppose everybody knows them, and that's the main thing. One as well thing to mention here, due to the security situation in Darfur, now very many areas are like out of the reach of the civil society due to the very many villages have been burned, and that actually is very difficult to monitor human rights in those locations as well. So I think in those very places it's difficult to mention if there is like clear information about who is detained and if they have access to justice, or if they have access to lawyers or family visit as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that? All right, let me go to the next question here. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add,
Okay,
Mr. Chairman.
yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add that, I mean, there are reports that over 100 people have been arrested and detained. Human Rights Watch, working together with others, we've been able to piece together a list of about 30, including government officials, civil society leaders, protest leaders, as well as some journalists. As far as we know, only 7 people have been released. No one knew the whereabouts of those who remain in detention. Some of those who released have said that they were held at its own prison in Khartoum. But we know that outside of Khartoum, a lot of arrests have also taken place. But you know, in the immediate aftermath of the coup, the internet was shut down, communication was shut down. It's been extremely difficult putting all of this information together. So we have basically determined that people have been held incommunicado and have been unfortunately forcibly disappeared, which is a crime under international human rights law. Mr. Chair, you're muted. Your mic is muted.
All right. Let me try this again. As the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights noted last month, that Sudan's women and girls have been active leaders in the movement for democracy and human rights in Sudan, and they're now being subjected to arrest, harassment, threats, and beatings. What are the consequences for the women and girls of Sudan if military rule is not reversed? How can the international community help protect their safety and their rights?
I can take the first go at that. I mean,
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
the rights of women and girls fall into a broader political landscape. And frankly, any return to an Islamist rule, which is what we're seeing through the consolidation of military and Islamist power through all these appointments, particularly in key legislative and security organs, means that you're going to get severe repression of women. We've seen this before. It was a hallmark of the Bashir era. We had the public order laws. We had other laws that disproportionately affected women and girls. We were likely to see a return of that if things go as they are. There were reforms put in under Hamdock's first government in June or July of 2020. They rolled back some of these issues, including by banning FGM and by completely getting rid of the public order laws. But we probably will see a return to that because it's a part of the toolkit of repression of a military Islamist government. You know, again, we have been here before. We sort of know what this looks like. So it's almost certain that we will see a return to these repressive measures.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else want to comment on that? Yeah, Mr. Adam.
I just wanted to add to what Khulud said. Some of the military leaders, they mentioned, announced publicly that they need protection if they needed to guarantee the security for people. And that as well includes we're asking for impunity, and that happened a few months ago, which tells the intention that they don't want to do the protection. That tells as well exactly how the women were like the first victim of this demonstrations, being beaten. 2 girls were killed, and it was one actually documented. It was a target. She was a public figure, activist, a leader in her community, and she was targeted and killed. Her name is Sita Nafar. So I think that is the situation. If remain the same, women will be suffering more and more, and they will actually go back to the laws that Khulud mentioned as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let me go to a last question. I'm going to ask all of you to respond to this, and we'll begin with Ms. Shagun. Look, what steps would you like to see from the United States government or Congress? I mean, what are the one or two most important things that we should be doing at this particular point? And again, we'll begin with Ms. Shagun, and I'll go right down the list.
I mean, I think that a couple of very quick things is one, the call for the release of all political detainees is key, including all of those detained because of their participation in demonstrations. It's also the key selective restrictive measures, including targeted sanctions against anyone who's been involved in the killing and violation of the rights of protesters, of all civilians in Sudan is important. And I think lastly, I would say the US administration should ensure that its policies reflect and is supportive of the wishes of the Sudanese people, not the people in government, not the political parties, not the military leadership, but the people who are represented by the civil society groups in the country and the broad-based protest movements. And finally, can I just add one more? You mentioned the OHCHR. The Sudanese authority, the US government should press the Sudanese authorities to allow for independent monitoring and reporting of the human rights situation in the country, notably by the UN Political Mission and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and should fully cooperate with the new OHCHR, that's the Human Rights Council and the Office of the High Commissioner's designated expert on Sudan. Very important. Thank you.
Mr. Adam.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to ask as well for very direct asks. First, there is no normalization with the current coup leaders unless they form an independent investigation committee, and that committee release the findings, and as well to release the findings for June 3rd committee as well. So people, victims' family are still waiting for that, for justice to happen, and that's not happening so far. The second ask is to pressure the leaders for serious institutional reforms, starting with the military, not to do it exactly how it happened with the NIS, how they just changed the names, but remains the same, the same institution. And lastly, to protect civilians, to have a civilian-led government, and as well actually just to check the visual evidence that we as well published, how we identified who participated in killings of civilians, and we have that report out and it's public for everyone. I think that could be used as well, one of the evidence, and we and other organizations very happy to collaborate and all time to support with this evidence. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hare.
I think there needs to be a demonstrable political will that supports the broader aim of the transition and doesn't get bogged down in this agreement, which, given the way it's been made up, may not last. I think engaging with the resistance committees is key. For one thing, they are sort of the real drivers of the change right now. And the other thing is that they're also monitoring human rights abuses quite well. And so engaging with them helps with up-to-date information. The second, I would say, to work with the international community within Sudan to come up with a common approach, because right now there's a lot of sort of, differences of opinion, shall we say, differences of approach, which the military will use to play one against the other, as Bashir successfully did for quite some time, particularly on issues of counterterrorism and migration, the former for the US, the latter for Europe. The third, I would say, to continue to put pressure on the four main supporters of the coup, so Egypt, Israel, Saudi, and the UAE, who all view Sudan through a security lens. So are, despite the rhetoric, almost certainly going to prefer a security actor or a military actor at the helm of the Sudanese government. And the last thing I would say is to resist this call for elections. A lot of the rhetoric that we saw coming out after the 21st of November agreement was to push for elections or to start thinking about elections. That conversation is far too premature, mostly because the National Elections Commission is going to be headed by an appointee by the Sovereign Council. The Sovereign Council right now is made up of the military, former rebels and Islamists, and that's not something that's going to lead to free and fair elections at all.
Thank you. Mr. Horner.
Yes, thank you. No, I mean, I'd like to actually sort of support several of the points that Khulud made, and certainly, first of all, is not to sort of canonize the political agreement that has just been arrived at. It was arrived at under duress, in a vastly lopsided fashion with, sort of key political figures arrested. So, it can be a framework perhaps to move ahead, but I wouldn't sort of give it too much weight. I think there is also perhaps within, as I speak to the intelligence services and to the rapid support forces, there's some confusion about, U.S. cooperation on counterterrorism, and perhaps that, signaling a larger level of, will to allow the Sudanese military to continue as it was, and that is a holdup from the Bashir era, Salah Ghosh era, when he was in charge of intel services. I'd also suggest a pivot in aid. Rethink how that is spent from USAID, OTI, and others, move that more towards civil society, even support the FFC to be a better political bloc, that they weren't great the first time around. Certainly, as I mentioned in my statement, certainly pressure on the military to incentivize better behavior by the prospect of sanctions, carrying the streets message better. There shouldn't be so much dissonance between international or let's say US messaging and that of the street. That should hew much more closely. And then the last thing, perhaps full circle, and to sort of follow up on a point that Brian Hunt may have made earlier, was that there is need for pressure on regional actors who, as Khulud said, do see Sudan through a security lens. They do believe that a securitized response to Sudan is the way forward, and that is just a decision that is made internally. But I think the last thing I want to say is that there is what I've found in research in the last couple of months since the coup, is that there's a interagency dissonance within in Jerusalem, in Abu Dhabi, and in Cairo, and that the intel services, the hawks within those governments are running this show on Sudan, and civilians are actually not comfortable with the way that their governments are actually running this out. So there is a dissonance there, and a lack of cohesion. That I think the U.S. should attend to and should think about who they meet with when they do indeed engage with those governments.
Thank you. I know Congressman Cori Bush is on the line.
Yes, I'm here.
You all
Yeah.
set?
I am.
Okay, I'm going to go vote. I'll be right back. You take over. All right.
Okay. All right, thank you. Thank you to our Chairman McGovern for convening this hearing. So I want to start my remarks today by paying homage to the millions of people in Sudan who have been courageously and unapologetically standing up for the possibility of a more free and equitable Sudan. To all of the people who have put their bodies on the line for a more just world, your sacrifices and your persistence have inspired us. So what we are seeing in Sudan and elsewhere is the capacity for a government to use tear gas, to use violence, militias, internet shutdowns to intimidate those speaking out, to suppress dissent and kill those standing up for justice. Militarized violence is no way for any government to govern. And I say that as someone who has been tear gassed and physically assaulted by law enforcement, as someone who was stomped on by police officers and who saw friends and neighbors arrested and violence unleashed in our streets as militarized police forces swarmed into our community, a community that was mourning and hurting, but also rising up for justice. I have watched loved ones die as a result of police violence, and I've counseled and grieved with my own community members, with our friends and our family members and neighbors who became survivors of crime and victims of violence and police brutality. The realities today on the ground across Sudan resonate deeply with me, and I hope that our collective pursuit for justice, our collective pursuit for liberation are one day actualized. Ms. Kerr, you state in your testimony that U.S. representation in Khartoum needs to find ways to support and listen to the country's powerful and complex protest movement. Can you expand on how best our government can do so?
Yes, thank you for the question, and thank you for your thoughts. The first thing to say is that resistance committees are by their nature quite, let's say, mistrusting of U.S. engagement for obvious reasons, for obvious historical reasons, and so that's definitely something to bear in mind. However, there are ways of sort of meeting them halfway, or at least offering them a menu of support that they would be able to choose from. It has to be led by them. But there are certainly, ways of, I mean, just thinking of your own experience, actually, that would be invaluable. Ways of mobilizing, ways of creating constituencies, ways of, speaking truth to power. Those are sort of happening organically anyway. But certainly learning from that experience, I think, would be invaluable. But more broadly, there are USAID OTI projects that are in the pipeline that could be pivoted to ensure that they meet the needs of resistance committees, particularly related to in-kind support when there is lack of internet, lack of connectivity, some of the sort of the hardware, if you will, of resistance movements, as well as support in sort of more of the training mentorship capacity. But all of this would be almost for nothing if at the broader, larger or higher level of political engagement, there isn't being pressure brought to bear on the military, on the aggressors in this case, to ensure that they allow for some of these spaces that have been very hard won to continue to be able to provide that space for civic engagement through resistance groups.
Thank you, thank you. I want to talk about the treatment of those on the street and specifically the use of tear gas against protesters. Reports from the last 24 to 48 hours alone show that the regime is using tear gas en masse to intimidate and physically assault people in the street. Ms. Shagun, can you talk a bit about what you see as unfolding in Khartoum against protesters? And more specifically, what kinds of tactics is the military regime using to suppress the protests?
Thank you, President Bush. We have seen, from the onset of the coup on October 25th, we have seen all of the security forces, including the Sudanese armed forces, the rapid support forces, the police, the different elements of police, use force against, including live ammunition, against the protesters. But as you mentioned, they have also used tear gas canisters as weapons. People have been hit by these canisters, and we have seen horrific injuries. One person who touched one of the canisters had it explode in their hand, and that the hand had to be amputated. We have seen the security forces use tactics, including the use of hospital ambulances to get through the barricades that the protesters have put up to protect themselves. They have attacked people in hospitals. They have harassed and tried to intimidate medical personnel who are performing life-saving treatments in hospitals and in other locations across Khartoum and elsewhere. They have arrested people in hospitals. So we are seeing people who have refused to go get treatment in hospitals because of the fear of arrest or being intimidated. And so there are people who are injured, who are sitting at home with their injuries, in pain, suffering because of their calling out for justice on the streets of Sudan. We have also seen that elsewhere in Sudan, a situation which has been neglected by many people because of the ongoing focus on Khartoum. It's in Darfur. In that restive region, we have continued to see that violence is ongoing. The security forces are aiding armed militiamen who are attacking civilians, including people in displacement camps. We have seen people killed in these attacks, even including in this last month, in November. We've seen this tactic to try to repress, to try to suppress the people's resistance to the military rule and to the new contraption that has been set up with the November 21 deal. All of these tactics have been extremely abusive. They are violations of human rights. And we are taking note, and we hope that the international community will ensure that there is justice for the victims and that those who have perpetrated these abuses are held to account in fair trials.
Thank you for sharing all of that. Thank you for being so open. I'm sorry for the abuses and the atrocities that are happening to people who don't deserve this. Very, very sorry. I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you very much. And to all the panelists, let me just say, we appreciate your testimony. I apologize for this kind of, unprecedented way of doing this, but we have, a series of votes. The alternative was to hold you for 3 hours and then get to questions. But Congresswoman Bush, we have to get her questions in, and then I think others may want to submit questions in writing. But let me just conclude by saying, all of us who have followed Sudan over the last several years, have watched with horror as atrocity after atrocity has occurred against the people, and we were hopeful, that we were about to enter a new era, and now we see this setback. So we appreciate your recommendations, and our concern is human rights, the human rights of the people of Sudan. And that's the way the United States should look at the situation. That's the way surrounding countries may look at the situation. If people are worried about security issues, the best security is to help create a stable Sudan where people's rights are protected. When people are oppressed, that encourages instability and civil unrest. So I just also want to say that I appreciate all of the work that you do in the various capacities that you represent. Please know that we are open to any suggestions in the future. You've given us some ideas to follow up on. We will do that. But I just wanted to thank you very much, and we will continue to stay in touch. All the best, and be safe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, everyone.
Well, the committee is adjourned.